The chief had been in country long enough to read the desert like a book. Years of deployments had taught him that every dune, every shadow, every shifting breeze carried meaning. He could tell the difference between a patrol track and an animal trail with one glance. He could sense when the silence meant safety and when it meant an ambush. But on that scorching afternoon, scanning the ridges with binoculars, he saw something he couldn't categorize. A figure. At first, it barely registered. The heat shimmer made the landscape ripple, distorting shapes and bending outlines into illusions. More than once, he'd raised his weapon against nothing but mirages. But this wasn't a trick. The figure was too deliberate, too still. Whoever it was had found high ground, nestled into the earth with purpose. The chief lowered his binoculars, rubbed his eyes against the glare, then raised them again. There she was. Long body stretched prone, elbows dug into the dust. A massive Barrett .50 caliber rifle lay in front of her, its long barrel extending like a spear toward the horizon. Most soldiers treated the Barrett like a tool of brute force, a weapon for vehicle stops, for punching through walls, for cracking enemy morale with its sheer thunder. But she held it differently. Her posture wasn't casual or careless. It was reverent. He studied her through the glass. She didn't twitch. She didn't shift. The world seemed to move around her, but she remained frozen, a fixture carved into the ridge. Sunlight caught the edge of her scope, flashing briefly before vanishing as she made a minute adjustment. Even at distance, he could tell she was breathing in rhythm, chest rising and falling with an almost meditative calm. The chief felt a prickle at the back of his neck. Snipers were his bread and butter. He had trained with them, fought alongside them, relied on them in missions where a single well-placed shot meant the difference between survival and body bags. But he had never seen anyone lie that still for that long. No nervous shifting, no anxious fidgeting, just total harmony with the weapon and the environment. "Chief, you see something?" The voice crackled in his earpiece, one of his squad leaders watching his body language. The chief hesitated before replying. "Maybe," he muttered. Not sure yet. He wasn't about to announce what he saw until he understood it himself. Through the binoculars again. She adjusted slightly, not with the jerky corrections of an amateur, but with the subtle grace of someone who understood patience. A grain of sand rolling under her forearm would have been enough to prompt that shift. That level of precision only came from years, decades, maybe, of discipline. But there was something else. The chief had worked with female operators before. Rare, but not unheard of. Some were as tough and capable as any man in his command. But this was different. She wasn't attached to his unit. She wasn't listed on any roster he'd been briefed on. And no lone sniper, male or female, had business operating without a spotter in this terrain. She was a ghost. The chief felt his jaw tighten. Ghosts were dangerous, especially the ones you didn't understand. A memory stirred rumors he'd overheard on other deployments. Stories traded in the back of Humvees or whispered over chow. A lone shooter, name unknown, moving silently from base to base. Some said she was Canadian, trained in the cold wilderness where patience was as natural as breathing. Others swore she was American, a product of some black-budget training program buried under layers of classification. Most chalked it up to battlefield myth, just another tale to pass the time when the desert stretched endless and the days blurred together. But as he watched her now, lying in perfect stillness with a weapon few dared to master, the chief felt the myth breathe into life. She adjusted the elevation dial on her scope with a feather-light touch, then settled again. Her trigger finger rested alongside the guard, not inside it. She was waiting for something, maybe someone. The chief checked his position. From where she lay, she had overwatch on their entire sector. If she wanted to, she could put a round straight through him. At that distance, the Barrett's recoil would sound like thunder, and his body would be crumpled before his men even registered the shot. The thought didn't scare him, not in the way a green soldier might fear it. Instead, it filled him with a wary respect. Whoever she wasn't careless. If she'd wanted him dead, he wouldn't still be standing. "Chief?" The voice in his comes again, more insistent this time. "You seeing hostiles?" He thought for a long moment, then answered carefully. "Negative. No hostiles." He lowered the binoculars and wiped sweat from his brow. But curiosity clawed at him, refusing to let go. He raised them again. Still there. Still unmoving. The chief found himself wondering what her eyes looked like behind that scope. Eyes told you everything about a sniper. Fear, hesitation, anger, none of those emotions had a place behind the glass. Good snipers had steady eyes. Great ones had cold eyes. But the legends? The ones who carved their names into history without ever signing them? Their eyes held nothing. Just silence. The sun began its slow crawl toward the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. Shadows lengthened across the ridge. Still she didn't move. For the first time in years, the chief felt unsettled. He had spent a lifetime spotting threats, cataloging enemies, and measuring danger by instinct. Yet here he was, staring at an operator who didn't fit into any box. Not ally, not enemy, not civilian. Just a presence. His instincts told him one thing clearly. She was lethal. But there was something else layered beneath the lethality. Something he couldn't quite name. Discipline? Yes. Experience? Certainly. But there was also an air of solitude, as though she had been carrying this role so long it had become her entire identity. The rifle wasn't just her weapon, it was her language, her expression, her reason for being. The chief lowered his binoculars one final time as dusk swallowed the desert. He felt the weight of what he had just seen pressing on him. Whoever she wasn't rumor anymore. She was flesh and blood. She was real. And she was watching the battlefield in ways most men could never dream of. For the first time in a long career, the chief realized he wasn't the one doing the spotting. That night, long after his men settled into uneasy rest, the chief lay awake under a sky littered with stars. The image of her on that ridge stayed burned into his mind. A phantom with a Barrett .50, still as stone, silent as death, waiting with the patience of eternity. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. But he knew this. Sooner or later, their paths would cross again. And when they did, the battlefield would never be the same. The chief had learned long ago that war zones had their own myths. Every conflict bred them like shadows stretching across the sand. Sometimes it was a ghost convoy that never reached its destination. Sometimes a rebel leader who could not be killed, no matter how many strikes were called on his compounds. Soldiers clung to stories the way drowning men clung to driftwood. It gave them something to talk about when the waiting got too long. But this one felt different. The ghost sniper. One of his men whispered over a cigarette, the glow of the ember sparking in the dark. They say she can split a man in half from 1.5 miles away. Doesn't miss. Doesn't flinch. Just deletes people from the planet. The chief didn't comment. He rarely did when the younger guys spun their tailies. He'd learned it was better to listen. Men revealed their fears and hopes in those half-joking legends. But inside, he filed the words away. She doesn't miss. Days earlier, he might have dismissed it as just another bedtime story for exhausted grunts. But after what he had seen on that ridge, the calm, the discipline, the eerie stillness, he wasn't so sure anymore. He caught fragments of rumors in mess tents, in the back of convoys, even in field reports, half scrubbed by intelligence officers. Each version contradicted the last. Some swore she was Canadian, the product of cold forests where stillness was second nature. Others insisted she was American, trained by a classified offshoot of JSOC. One report even hinted she wasn't military at all, an embedded contractor, a rogue operator with no official record. The chief knew better than to chase ghosts. Yet he found himself doing exactly that, piecing together scraps of overheard conversations, like a man assembling a puzzle with half the pieces missing. She doesn't talk to anyone. Just shows up when she's needed. They say she eats alone. Always alone. Hell, I heard she once made a shot in the middle of a sandstorm. The chief had spent decades surrounded by some of the toughest men alive. He'd fought beside SEALs, Marines, Rangers, Green Barrett's operators who carved their place in history with grit and blood. But the way men spoke of this phantom was different. There was no bravado in their voices, no attempt to one-up each other's tailies. Instead, there was reverence, respect, and a little fear. He didn't like that. In his world, fear had to be named, understood, and controlled. But how could you name what you didn't understand? The chief returned often to the ridge where he had first spotted her. Not openly, he wasn't about to advertise that he was hunting shadows, but in quiet moments, scanning with binoculars under the pretense of checking the terrain. Sometimes he thought he caught a flicker of movement. Sometimes he thought he saw the glint of glass. But she was never where he expected, and always gone before he could be sure. It reminded him of the way predators stalked in the wild. The hunter saw you long before you saw them. One evening, as the desert cooled and his men sat cleaning their rifles, he overheard Corporal Jennings whispering to another operator. "Chief ever tell you the story of Hathcock, the Marine sniper in Nam?" The other man shook his head. Guy crawled for days on his belly through the grass, inch by inch, to take out a North Vietnamese general. Didn't eat. Didn't drink. Ants crawling all over him. Whole time, if he moved wrong, he was dead. Made the shot. Changed the war. The chief almost smiled. He'd heard that one 1,000 times. But then Jennings lowered his voice, eyes darting toward the chief. "Some say this one's the same kind. Maybe better." The chief set his jaw and focused on the rifle he was stripping. The comparison gnawed at him. Hathcock had been a legend, but at least he'd been flesh and blood, a Marine with a name and a service record. This woman was nothing but whispers and shadows. And yet he had seen her. That fact alone set her apart from rumor. He hadn't just heard the story. He'd glimpsed the ghost in flesh and steel. That night, lying awake beneath the endless desert sky, he replayed the image in his mind. Her body, perfectly aligned with the Barrett. The subtle adjustments, the stillness of her breathing. He thought of how she could have ended him then and there, and how she hadn't. That choice unsettled him more than the rifle itself. Why hadn't she taken the shot? The chief understood battlefield calculus. Every action was weighed against its cost. If she were hostile, his life would have been a prize worth taking. The fact that she hadn't meant one of two things. Either she wasn't the enemy, or she didn't care enough to bother. Neither answer gave him comfort. Over the following days, the chief watched for patterns. Where the enemy moved, where the terrain funneled fire. And sometimes, when he looked carefully enough, he saw the faintest sign that she had been there. A scuff on a rock, a disturbed patch of sand. Never enough for his men to notice, but enough for him. The desert was starting to feel less like empty terrain and more like a chessboard. And somewhere out there, he realized, she was already 10 moves ahead. It was during a briefing that the last piece slid into place. Intel analysts were outlining probable insurgent positions when one of the officers mentioned, almost as an afterthought, unconfirmed reports suggest a high-value target was neutralized last week. Distance was extreme, possibly over 2,000 meters. No attribution yet. The room went quiet for a heartbeat, then shifted back to business. But the chief didn't hear the rest. 2,000 meters. He thought again of her stillness, the calm, the way she melted into the earth like she belonged there. His pulse quickened despite himself. This wasn't coincidence. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her orders. But he knew the battlefield didn't lie. Whoever she was, she had just stepped out of myth and into his war. And if the rumors were even half true, the chief wasn't sure whether to feel relieved she wasn't aiming at him, or worried about what kind of storm she was about to unleash. The desert was cruel that afternoon, the kind of heat that sucked the air from your lungs and baked the skin beneath your armor. The chief moved with his squad through the valley, eyes sharp, rifle ready, every sense stretched taut. Years in the field had made him suspicious of quiet, and the silence now was heavy, too heavy. He felt it before he heard it. That crawling sensation up the spine, the one every operator learned to trust. Something was wrong. Then it happened. The first burst of machine gun fire ripped across the rocks, echoing in sharp cracks. Dust exploded at their feet. Men dove for cover, shouts rising in the chaos. The valley erupted into a storm of bullets, tracers streaking like molten fire through the haze. Contact front. One of his men shouted. The chief dropped behind a jagged outcrop, scanning for movement. Insurgents had the high ground, dug into positions they must have prepared days earlier. The kill zone was perfect, and his team was caught in it. He barked orders, directing fire, trying to find an opening. Then came the sound that changed everything. A thunderclap. Low, powerful, unmistakable, the voice of the Barrett .50. The chief's head snapped toward the ridge. A figure lay prone, just visible through the smoke and heat. Her, the ghost. He watched through a gap in the rocks as she squeezed the trigger again. Another thunderclap. Another hostile crumpled on the ridge, body folding as though pulled by an invisible string. For a heartbeat, the battlefield hesitated. The insurgents weren't expecting it. Neither were his men. Where the hell did that come from? Jennings shouted, peering out from cover. The chief didn't answer. His eyes were locked on her. Calm, precise, deliberate, each movement exact. Where his men fired in bursts of adrenaline and desperation, she was surgical, placing every round with a surgeon's precision. He raised his binoculars in the middle of the firefight, something he never would have dared under normal circumstances. Through the glass, he saw her face in glimpses, expressionless, focused, her cheek pressed against the stock. Her breathing looked steady, almost unnaturally so, as if she existed in a pocket of silence, untouched by the chaos below. Another shot cracked. An insurgent toppled backward from his firing position, his weapon clattering down the slope. The chief's men regained their footing, emboldened by the unseen support. They poured fire into the enemy positions, gaining ground inch by inch. But he knew it wasn't their volume of fire making the difference. It was her. She was dismantling the ambush, piece by piece. One hostile tried to sprint across open ground, perhaps aiming to flank. The Barrett boomed. He collapsed mid-stride, a puppet with its strings cut. Another leaned out from cover, RPG on his shoulder. Another boom. The warhead tumbled harmlessly into the dust, the man lying still beside it. The chief found himself watching her more than the battle. It was rare to see mastery so complete, so uncheckable. Most snipers, even good ones, showed signs of the fight-quick adjustments, shifts in position, visible strain in their faces. She showed none. She was a machine wrapped in human skin, breathing only to keep the rifle steady. Still, one question gnawed at him. Who the hell is she working for? He had no answer, But right then, he didn't care. His men were alive because of her. A fight dragged on for minutes that felt like hours. Finally, under the crushing pressure of coordinated fire and a relentless precision, the insurgents broke. Survivors scrambled from their positions, fleeing across the rocks. Some didn't make it far. Her scope followed them like a shadow, and the Barrett thundered until silence reclaimed the valley. The chief lowered his rifle, sweat streaming down his neck. His men emerged from cover, breathing hard, checking ammo, slapping each other on the back. Relief poured through the squad, laughter breaking out in sharp bursts as adrenaline leaked away. But the chief's eyes were still on the ridge. She was there, unmoving, still prone behind the Barrett, watching the battlefield with that same eerie patience. He wanted to signal her, to wave, to acknowledge what she had done. But something in her posture told him not to. She wasn't there for recognition. She wasn't waiting for thanks. She was watching. Always watching. And just like that, she moved. A shift of her body. A slow crawl backward. She melted into the rocks. Her rifle, the last thing to disappear from view. Gone. The chief exhaled slowly, realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Chief," Jennings said, walking up with a grin. "Whoever was on that ridge saved our asses, sir. I mean, did you see those shots? Who was it?" The chief looked at him, then back at the empty ridge. "Not sure," he said finally. "But she's not just a rumor." Jennings frowned, confused. The chief didn't elaborate. As the squad regrouped and prepared to move out, the chief kept scanning the horizon. The battlefield was theirs again, but he knew it wasn't because of his leadership or his men's firepower. It was because of her. That ghost with the Barrett. And though she was gone now, he felt her presence lingering, as if the desert itself had absorbed her into its silence. He couldn't shake the thought that this was only the beginning. The desert was different after a battle. The chief always noticed it the way silence returned slowly, hesitantly, as if the earth itself feared another eruption of violence. That night, the sky was smeared with starlight, the kind that stretched endless across the horizon. His men had set up a small camp, their laughter ringing out in bursts as they traded stories and shook off the adrenaline. But the chief wasn't laughing. He kept glancing toward the ridge. She had vanished after the firefight, melting into the terrain as if she were a part of it. No trace, no tracks, no lingering silhouette against the skyline. Ghosts didn't leave footprints. But something told him she was still nearby. Around midnight, when the camp settled and only the crackle of the fire broke the quiet, the chief made his move. He slipped away without a word, climbing a narrow trail that wound up toward the high rocks. His boots found silent purchase. Years of practice made his steps whisper soft. He moved slow, steady, scanning for the smallest signs. Then he saw it. A faint glimmer of metal under moonlight. He dropped low, crouching behind a rock. Just ahead, tucked against the stone, she lay in the same position he had seen before, Barrett stretched before her, body perfectly aligned. Only this time, she wasn't aiming. She was cleaning. The Barrett lay disassembled across a cloth. The receiver glistened with fresh oil. The bolt was stripped, every groove wiped with precise strokes. She moved with unhurried rhythm, each action deliberate, as though the rifle were not a machine but a companion. The chief watched in silence, studying her. There was no wasted movement, no frustration, no impatience. Just reverence. Finally, he stepped out from cover. Her head lifted instantly, eyes locking on him. Her hand brushed the Barrett's receiver in a subtle motion that made it clear she could reassemble and fire in seconds if she chose. "You move quieter than most," she said softly. Her voice was low, calm, carrying no surprise. The chief stopped a few paces away. And you move quieter than all. For a moment, the desert held its breath. Two predators, studying each other in the moonlight. He nodded toward the Barrett. Not many treat that thing like it's holy. Her eyes flicked down to the rifle. She ran a cloth along the bolt face, slow and steady. That's because most people think it's just a gun. A hammer, a tool to break things. And you don't? The chief asked. She looked back up at him, her expression unreadable. No, this isn't a hammer. It's a promise. The chief tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. Promise of what? Patience, she said simply. Control, discipline. The Barrett doesn't forgive mistakes. It magnifies them. You don't force it, you respect it. If you rush it, it punishes you. If you fight it, it owns you. But if you listen to it, she trailed off, eyes drifting toward the stars. It becomes more than steel. The chief had heard snipers wax poetic about their rifles before, but this was different. Most men boasted about range, about stopping power. She spoke as if the weapon was alive, as if it breathed with her. You talk about it like it's part of you, he said. Her hands paused for just a heartbeat, then continued their careful work. It is. When I'm behind it, there's nothing else. No noise, no chaos. Just breath, wind, distance, and the truth between me and the target. The chief felt a chill crawl across his skin. There was no bravado in her tone, no arrogance. Just conviction. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was telling him how she survived. Where'd you learn that? He asked quietly. Her eyes flicked to him again. A long silence stretched, broken only by the whisper of the cloth against steel. Some things you don't learn, she said at last. Some things you just become. He studied her face in the dim light, but it gave away nothing. No patch, no insignia, no unit markers. Just the faint shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes, the kind that came not from sleepless nights, but from carrying a weight too heavy for one person. The chief lowered himself onto a rock a few feet away, watching her reassemble the rifle with fluid precision. The heavy receiver clicked into place. The bolt slid smooth as water. She worked in silence, and he found himself respecting that silence. In war, men talk too much. They filled the air with chatter, with noise, as if afraid of what they might hear in the quiet. But she seemed to belong to it. Finally, he spoke again. You saved my men today. Her hands never stopped moving. I saved myself, she said softly. Your men just happened to be in the way. The chief frowned. That's a cold answer. She set the Barrett gently in her lap, her fingers brushing along its length. War is cold. You know that. He couldn't argue. Not really. But something about the way she said it unsettled him. You're not on my roster, he said carefully. Not in any report I've seen. I'm not on anyone's roster. That hung in the air like smoke. The chief leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. Then why are you here? Her gaze returned to the stars. Because someone has to be. It wasn't an answer. Or maybe it was the only answer he was going to get. For a long time, neither spoke. The desert hummed with quiet, the chirp of distant insects, the whisper of wind over stone. She finished reassembling the Barrett and set it beside her, the barrel stretching into the night like a silver spear. The chief finally stood. My men will be asking questions. They want to know who pulled us out today. Then tell them it doesn't matter, she said, her voice calm. Tell them the desert has eyes. He studied her one last time, then nodded. Fair enough. He turned and started back down the trail, his boots crunching softly in the sand. Behind him, the silence swallowed her again. But as he walked, one thought dug deeper into his mind. He had seen soldiers treat their rifles as tools, as weapons, even as lifelines. But never like this. Never with this kind of devotion. She wasn't carrying the Barrett. She was the Barrett. And that realization, more than the memory of her thunderous shots, made him understand this wasn't just another sniper. This was someone the war itself had created. The morning broke with a cruel stillness. The desert was flat and unforgiving, its horizon blurred by heat waves, even in the early light. The chief crouched beside his men on the ridge, scanning the distance through his binoculars. Below, a convoy moved with careful precision, 3 armored vehicles and a cluster of fighters on motorcycles, their dust trails twisting upward into the pale sky. Intel had been clear. A high-value target was moving with them. Someone important enough to shift the balance of the conflict. Someone too dangerous to slip away. The chief knew the mission was almost impossible. The convoy was well guarded, their formation disciplined. Getting close without being spotted was suicide. Air support wasn't an option. The only chance was a shot. So far it bordered on fantasy. His men whispered doubts, their nerves barely contained. But then he caught movement at the edge of the ridge. She was there. The mysterious sniper, the woman with the Barrett, moving as silently as shadow. She carried the rifle across her back, the weight of it looking as natural as a second spine. Her eyes swept over the terrain, calm and calculating. Without a word, she climbed higher onto a flat outcrop of stone, her movements fluid and practiced. The chief followed, his gut tightening. He had seen her before. He had seen what she could do. But even he couldn't believe what was about to happen. She dropped prone, laying the Barrett across the rock with slow, deliberate care. The barrel pointed toward the shimmering horizon. From this distance, the convoy was little more than a smear of dust and faint silhouettes. 3 kilometers, the chief muttered. Too far. The wind alone. She cut him off with a quiet glance. No arrogance. Just certainty. She unfolded her spotter's scope, aligning it with the rifle. Her hands moved with unshakable precision, adjusting elevation, windage, dialing turrets. She didn't rush. She didn't second-guess. Every movement was a ritual, each adjustment measured by something deeper than numbers. The chief crouched beside her, torn between awe and disbelief. No one makes that shot. Not at this distance. Her lips curved, the faintest shadow of a smile. Someone does. He fell silent, watching her work. The wind shifted slightly, carrying heat and sand across the ridge. She raised a small piece of cloth and let it flutter, watching its movement before adjusting her scope again. Then she pressed her cheek against the stock, her body aligning perfectly behind the weapon. Everything slowed. The chief realized she wasn't just looking through glass. She was sinking into the rifle, becoming part of it. Her breathing steadied, so calm it seemed unnatural. The desert, the heat, the world itself narrowed into a single thread between shooter and target. Through his binoculars, the chief focused on the convoy. The motorcycles weaved alongside the vehicles, and in the center sat the armored SUV, the one carrying the target. He could barely make out the faint blur of a figure through the tinted glass. 3,247 meters away. Impossible, he muttered under his breath. But her finger was already curling toward the trigger. The Barrett roared. The sound ripped through the silence like thunder, rolling across the desert. The recoil slammed her shoulder, but she absorbed it with fluid grace, already cycling the bolt with mechanical precision. The chief tracked the round through his scope. At that distance, it was like watching a star streak across space, an arc of impossible velocity cutting through the air. Seconds passed. Too many seconds. Then the SUV shuddered. The windshield spiderwebbed outward, glass erupting in a halo of dust and fragments. The vehicle swerved violently, skidding sideways as the motorcycles scattered in chaos. Through the binoculars, The chief saw him the target. A man slumped forward, his chest punched open, blood painting the inside of the glass. The shot hadn't just connected, it had annihilated him. 3,247 meters. The chief's breath caught. He lowered the binoculars slowly, almost afraid the image would vanish if he looked away. She was already reloading, her face expressionless. No celebration. No triumph. Just calm inevitability, as if this were not a miracle, but simply the outcome she expected. The men behind them erupted in whispers, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Holy, did she just? 3 clicks? No way, no way. That's not even possible. The chief ignored them. He turned his gaze back to her. You planned that, he said quietly. She blinked, her lashes lowering for a heartbeat. I prepared for it. There's a difference. He studied her, his mind racing. The calculations alone, the drop, the wind drift, the Earth's curvature, all of it should have made the shot impossible. And yet she had done it, not with hesitation, not with luck, but with certainty. Who are you? He asked. Her hands rested gently on the Barrett, her gaze fixed on the horizon. No one, she said softly. Then, after a pause, no one they'll ever see coming. The convoy below was in chaos now. Fighters scrambled, shouting, firing aimlessly into the empty desert. They didn't know where the shot had come from, didn't understand they were already ghosts. The chief's men began to retreat, adrenaline surging, but he lingered a moment longer. He watched her pack the Barrett away with the same reverence as always, each piece folded into its place. To her, this wasn't victory. It was just another breath, another heartbeat in a war without end. As she rose to leave, the chief found himself speaking without thinking. They'll write about this one, he said. 3,247 meters. The longest confirmed kill in history. She looked back at him, her eyes glinting in the morning light. Let them write, she said. I don't do this for history. And then she was gone, fading into the desert, leaving only silence and the echo of the impossible behind her. The chief stood frozen on the ridge, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing against his chest. He knew he would carry this memory forever, the moment he saw the impossible become real. The shot wasn't just a record. It was proof that legends weren't born. They were made, one trigger pull at a time. War had a way of turning truth into myth. The shot hadn't been logged, not officially. No mission report carried her name. No signature, no acknowledgement. Yet by the next morning, the chief realized that secrecy was a lost cause. Soldiers talk and soldiers embellish. By dawn, whispers were already rippling through the ranks like sparks across dry grass. 3 clicks, they said. No more than that over 3-2. Broke the record. Bull, that's impossible. Ask the guys who were there. SUV shattered like glass. Target dropped like he'd been struck by lightning. The chief walked through camp, listening without comment. Every tent he passed, every fire pit he skirted, he heard her name, even though no one actually knew it. They called her the Ghost, the Shadow, the Angel with the Barrett, nicknames born from awe and uncertainty. Each one stripped her further from reality, pulling her closer to legend. He tried to shut it out, but even his own men kept circling back to it. You saw it, Chief. She pulled it off. 3,247 meters. That's insane. No one else alive could have made that shot. No one. The chief would answer with silence. He didn't want to argue, didn't want to add fuel to the fire. But the truth lingered in his chest like a stone. They were right. He had seen it. He couldn't unsee it. Later, in the command tent, the whispers turned sharper. A colonel from another unit leaned across the table, voice low. We're hearing reports of a sniper operating outside standard channels. High-value kill confirmed, long-range engagement. Is it true? The chief's jaw tightened. Depends what you've heard, the colonel smirked. That someone just set a world record under our noses. The chief said nothing. The colonel leaned back, his smile fading into something colder. If that's true, command will want details. We can't afford unsanctioned assets running around. Liability like that could burn us. The chief met his eyes steadily. Or save us. The colonel frowned but said no more. Outside, the rumors grew legs of their own. Every retelling made the distance longer, the conditions harsher, the kill cleaner. Men spoke of her as though she wasn't human-like. She was fate itself, disguised as a sniper. Some said she never missed. Some claimed she could shoot through walls, through shadows, through time itself. In war, exaggeration was currency. But not all whispers were in awe. The enemy heard them too. Intercepted comms revealed chatter across enemy bands. Paranoia surged through their ranks. Convoys rerouted. Movements slowed. Fighters abandoned patrols, muttering about the ghost sniper who could strike from beyond sight. Fear was spreading like poison, and with fear came bounty. Word reached the chief that insurgent leaders had placed a price on her head. A staggering sum, more than most mercenaries would see in a lifetime. Kill the ghost, they said. Kill the woman with the Barrett. The chief carried that knowledge like a weight. Because as much as her legend helped, it also painted a target on her back. That night, he found her again. She was perched on a dune beyond camp, silhouetted against the moonlight. The Barrett rested across her knees, her hands folded loosely over the receiver. She didn't look at him as he approached. "They're talking about you," he said quietly. "They always talk," she replied. "Not like this. You've become more than a soldier to them. They're turning you into a story." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Stories don't bleed. They also don't die," the chief countered. "But soldiers do." For a moment, her eyes flicked toward him. There was no pride in them, no satisfaction, only weariness. "I didn't take that shot to be remembered," she said. "I took it because it needed to be done. Nothing more." The chief studied her profile, the way the moonlight carved sharp edges across her face. She spoke with conviction, but he wondered if she realized how little control she had now. Once a story escaped, it couldn't be caged. "You understand what this means, don't you?" he asked. "Every soldier who hears the story will look for you. Every enemy will hunt you. The higher you rise, the shorter the fall." She finally turned to meet his gaze. Her voice was steady. "Then let them hunt." The chief wanted to argue, but he didn't, because part of him believed her. The silence stretched between them until she broke it. "You're not afraid of me," she said, almost curious. "I've fought beside monsters," the chief replied. "You don't scare me." Her eyes softened, just barely. "Good, because I'm not a monster." The chief held her gaze, but he didn't answer. Because in his heart, he wasn't sure. When he returned to camp, the whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they had grown louder, more feverish. Men leaned in close to fires, telling the story as though they'd been there, as though they'd seen the impossible shot with their own eyes. The chief realized something then. The truth no longer mattered. It wasn't about the distance. It wasn't about the kill. It was about the idea that somewhere out there was a woman with a rifle who could change the tide of war with a single trigger pull. And that idea was far more dangerous than any bullet. The chief lay awake that night, staring at the canvas ceiling of his tent. He replayed the sound of the Barrett in his mind, the thunder that had split the desert. He thought of her calm eyes, her steady hands, her refusal to accept glory. She didn't want to be a legend. But legends weren't chosen. They were forged in the stories men told to survive. By morning, he knew one thing for certain. The whispers wouldn't stop, and neither would she. The chief had been in impossible situations before: ambushes, black ops, missions where failure meant certain death. But this was different. It wasn't bullets whizzing past his head that kept him awake at night. It was questions. By the time a week had passed since the 3,247-meter shot, the whispers had swollen into a storm. Command had caught the scent. Reports demanded clarification. Officers pressed him for details. Who was the sniper? Where did she come from? Was she sanctioned? Was she controllable? The chief had no answers he was willing to give. Inside the command tent, he faced another round of thinly veiled interrogation. A general's voice came across the encrypted line, crisp and cold. "Chief, we have confirmation of the long-range kill. It's already spreading through the ranks. We need the name of the shooter." The chief's jaw tightened. "There's no name to give. That's unacceptable. A shot like that doesn't happen by chance. Someone is operating outside the chain of command, and I want them under control." "With respect, sir," the chief replied evenly. "Whoever took that shot saved lives. Mine included. I'm not inclined to leash a ghost." The general's silence was sharper than anger. When he finally spoke, his voice carried steel. "Find her, chief, or I'll send someone who will." The line went dead. The chief sat alone in the dim glow of the tent lamp, the words echoing in his head. He had built his career on loyalty to his men, to the mission, to the flag stitched onto his shoulder. But now, for the first time, he found those loyalties pulling in opposite directions. If he gave her up, she'd be swallowed whole by the machine-tested, prodded, weaponized. She'd become nothing more than a number in a classified file. Her freedom gone, her silence broken. If he protected her, he'd be defying orders, risking his career, risking court-martial. And if he did nothing, then the vultures circling above would close in, and she'd be hunted not just by enemies, but by the very people she had saved. That night, he walked out of camp, the desert wind tugging at his jacket. He found her where he always did, away from the noise, away from the men. She was sitting cross-legged atop a boulder, the Barrett resting across her lap like a sentinel. She didn't look up when he approached. "They're pressing you, aren't they?" The chief stopped short. "How do you know that?" Her lips curved faintly, though her eyes stayed on the horizon. "Because that's what armies do. They don't tolerate mysteries. They dissect them." He studied her in silence. Even now, she spoke without fear, as if she had already accepted whatever fate awaited her. That calmness infuriated him. "They want your name," he said. "They want to drag you into the light." She finally looked at him, and for a heartbeat, he felt the weight of her gaze. "And what do you want, Chief?" The question cut deeper than he expected. He wanted to say he wanted her safe. He wanted to say he wanted her alive. But he also wanted to know the truth, to peel back the layers of shadow she wrapped herself in. He wanted to understand why someone with her skill fought without a unit, without recognition, without even a name. Instead, he said the only thing that felt true. "I want to do right by my men." Her head tilted slightly. "Then protect them from me." The chief frowned. "From you?" She nodded once. "From the story. From what it will turn into. Soldiers don't need myths. They need reality. They need leaders like you, not phantoms like me." For a moment, anger sparked in his chest. "Don't do that. Don't downplay what you've done. That shot, you changed the war." Her expression didn't shift. "No, I delayed it." The words chilled him. She rose smoothly to her feet, the Barrett sliding into place across her shoulder. The moonlight caught the curve of her cheek, making her seem less like flesh and more like something carved from the night itself. "You'll have to decide soon," she said softly, "whether you tell them what they want to hear, or whether you let the story keep breathing on its own." "And if I tell them?" he asked. "Then you'll have to live with what they turn me into." Her voice lingered in his ears long after she disappeared into the dunes. Back in camp, the chief lay awake again, staring at the canvas ceiling. His thoughts circled endlessly, like vultures around carrion. One path meant obedience, the preservation of his career, the approval of the machine. But it also meant betraying her trust, even if she had never asked for it. The other path meant defiance, shielding her, protecting the silence she carried like a second weapon. But defiance had consequences. Men under his command had been destroyed for less. By dawn, his decision hadn't come. He walked through camp hollow-eyed, listening again to the whispers that grew louder with each passing day. 3,247 meters. No one else could do it. She's a ghost. Maybe not even real. The chief realized the cruel irony. The less she spoke, the more others filled the silence with myth. And the more the myth grew, the more dangerous it became for her, for him, for everyone caught in its orbit. By the end of the week, he was summoned again to the content. Another message from command. This one wasn't a request. It was an order. Identify the sniper within 72 hours. The chief stood there after the line went dead, his fists clenched at his sides. His men watched him carefully, curiosity in their eyes. They didn't know the weight of the decision crushing him. 72 hours. That was all the time he had left to decide, duty or loyalty, truth or myth. And for the first time in his life, the chief wasn't sure which path was right. The order weighed on him like body armor soaked in blood. 72 hours. That was all command had given the chief. Identify the sniper, or they would take the matter out of his hands. They'd send others, men who didn't care about whispers or shadows. Men who would rip apart every dune, interrogate every soldier, until the ghost was dragged into the light. For 2 days, the chief avoided her. He buried himself in reports, briefings, training drills, anything to avoid the truth clawing at his conscience. His men watched him closely, sensing something in the way his jaw clenched tighter with every passing hour. By the third day, the silence in camp was suffocating. Even the whispers had dulled, replaced by a strange tension. The soldiers knew something was coming, though none of them could name it. That night, under a sky thick with stars, the chief found himself walking into the desert. His feet carried him without thought, instinct guiding him to the same ridge where he had first seen her. And there she was. Prone, the Barrett stretched before her, her eye behind the scope. She didn't flinch as he approached. Didn't move, didn't breathe, only existed in that endless line between shooter and horizon. Finally, she spoke. "They gave you a deadline." The chief froze. "You knew?" "I didn't need to. Armies are predictable. They don't like loose ends." He lowered himself beside her, scanning the horizon, though he knew she wasn't tracking a target. She was simply lying there, fused with the rifle, as if it were her natural state. "They'll come for you," he said. "If I don't give them something, they'll tear this place apart. And they won't care who gets caught in the storm." Her finger rested lightly along the trigger guard, though her gaze never left the scope. "So give them something." The chief frowned. "Like what?" She finally turned her head, meeting his eyes. "Not me." "A ghost." He stared at her, realization dawning. She wasn't asking him to lie. She was asking him to bury her even deeper. To let the myth consume the woman until all that remained was a story no one could ever touch. "You want me to erase you," he said slowly. Her expression softened. "I was never here to begin with." The chief's chest tightened. He had spent weeks trying to understand her, to peel back the layers of mystery. And now, at the moment of truth, she was asking him to let her vanish entirely. He thought of his men, of the way their eyes lit with awe when they whispered her name. He thought of command, cold and ruthless, salivating at the chance to turn her into a weapon. And he thought of her calm, steady, carrying the weight of silence like no one he had ever known. "You deserve more than that," he muttered. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "No, I deserve peace." "That's not the same thing." The desert wind carried her words away, scattering them like sand. For a long moment, neither moved. The chief's mind churned with the weight of the decision. Obedience or defiance? Truth or legend? Duty or humanity? Then he stood. By dawn, the report was on command's desk. It was brief, clinical, precise, just the way they liked it. Subject: ghost sniper status, unknown description, unconfirmed. Witness accounts unreliable. Kill record disputed. Presence unverifiable. Conclusion mythological. Not operationally relevant. The chief had buried her in paperwork. Buried her in doubt. Buried her in legend. When command's reply came, it was exactly what he expected. Proceed with mission objectives. Ignore rumor. The machine had moved on. Back in the desert, the chief found her one last time. She was sitting on the same ridge, the Barrett across her knees, watching the horizon with those calm, endless eyes. "It's done," he told her. She nodded once, as if she had known all along. "Good." He studied her, wanting to ask the questions he had never dared to. Who she was. Where she came from. What ghosts haunted her in the quiet hours. But he didn't, because he realized the answers didn't matter. She wasn't meant to be understood. She was meant to be remembered. "I hope you find peace," he said finally. Her gaze drifted back to the horizon. "Out here, peace is just another kind of silence." The chief turned to leave, his boots crunching softly in the sand. When he looked back, she was already fading into the dunes, swallowed by the desert as if she had never existed at all. But he knew better. Because legends don't die. They live in whispers, in firelight stories, in the silence before dawn, when men wonder if death has eyes. And somewhere, out there beyond the horizon, the ghost still watched through her scope, breath steady, finger poised, waiting for the next impossible shot. The chief carried that truth with him for the rest of his life, not as a soldier's memory, but as a man's burden. He had chosen silence over obedience, legend over control. And though he would never see her again, he knew she was still out there, somewhere between shadow and starlight. Not a soldier, not a myth, something in between. The Barrett .50 was just steel and glass and powder. But in her hands, it had become something else entirely. And so had she. Weeks passed. The desert changed. The mission changed. But she remained a ghost. After the chief filed the report and buried her existence under layers of bureaucracy, life in the forward operating base returned to a strange kind of normal. Convoys resumed. Patrols continued. Orders came and went. On the surface, the war marched on exactly as it always had. But beneath that thin veneer of normalcy, everything was different. Soldiers spoke of her still. Even with no official record, the story spread farther than the desert winds could carry it. It slipped into briefing rooms, into barracks, into the quiet spaces between men when fear crept in. They called her by dozens of names now: Longshot, the Sand Wraith, 3K, and most often, the Ghost. Each version of the story twisted the details. Some claimed she was a special operative from a unit so secret it didn't exist on paper. Others swore she was a civilian sniper hired by the government. A few even whispered she wasn't real at all, that the shot was fired by a drone or a malfunctioning piece of artillery. The chief never corrected them, because the truth no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the myth. Yet the myth had consequences. Enemy patrols changed their behavior. They traveled only at night, under heavy cover. They doubled their spotters, tripled their scouts. They deployed decoys and counter-snipers, wasting precious resources to fight a ghost that no one could confirm existed. And even within their own ranks, the psychological shift was undeniable. Soldiers walked a little taller. They moved through the battlefield with the quiet assurance that somewhere out there, unseen and untouchable, an invisible guardian watched over them. But with that reassurance came expectation. Will she be there again? A young sniper asked the chief one night during a pre-mission briefing. Will the ghost cover us? Another added, half joking, half serious. The chief's response was always the same. Don't count on ghosts. Count on yourselves. But he knew the truth. Even he had started scanning the horizon during missions, his eyes drawn to the distant ridgelines, searching for a glint of glass or the faint outline of a prone silhouette. Sometimes he swore he saw her. Weeks turned to months. Operations blurred together. The chief rose through the ranks, his name appearing on more reports and commendations than he could remember. But the one thing that never faded was the story. It followed him like a shadow, whispered wherever he went. And then, one night, she returned. It was just before dawn, and the chief was alone on a high observation post overlooking a valley scarred by war. The stars were fading, the horizon bleeding pale orange. He stood in silence, sipping bitter coffee from a tin cup, when a voice drifted behind him. You lied for me? He didn't turn. He didn't need to. I told the truth they needed to hear. Soft footsteps approached. She stopped beside him, hands tucked into the pockets of a weather-worn jacket. The Barrett wasn't with her this time, a rare sight. Without it, she seemed smaller, quieter, human. You could have turned me in, she said. They would have offered you a promotion, maybe a command. You would have been celebrated. Maybe, he admitted. But then they would have broken you. She studied him for a long time, the first light of dawn catching her eyes. And now? Now, he said with a faint smile, they're still chasing a story. And you're still free. Silence fell between them. It wasn't awkward or heavy, just the kind of silence shared between two people who had been through too much, together to need words. I've been thinking about leaving, she said finally. He glanced at her. Leaving the war? All of it, she replied. The fighting, the killing, the running. I've done what I came here to do. The chief frowned. And what was that? Balance the scales, she said quietly. At least a little. He didn't press her. He didn't ask who she had lost or what ghosts she carried. He knew those answers were buried deep, locked behind scars too old and too painful to reopen. So where will you go? He asked. Someplace without horizons, she said with a faint smile. Where rifles are tools for sport, not survival. Where silence means peace, not danger. The chief nodded slowly. You think you can outrun the legend? I don't need to, she said. I just need to stop feeding it. They watched the sunrise together, the desert glowing gold beneath the dawn. For a brief moment, the war felt far away, a distant thing that belonged to another lifetime. Then she turned to him and held out her hand. Goodbye, Chief. He looked at it, then at her, and shook it firmly. Goodbye, Ghost. She smiled at that, a real smile, small and fleeting, and then she walked away. Her figure grew smaller and smaller against the rising sun until she was just a silhouette, and then she was gone. The chief never saw her again. But the legend never died. Months later, He heard whispers again, not from his unit this time, but from other corners of the world. In a distant conflict zone, a warlord had been killed by a single shot from over 3 kilometers away. In another, a hostage convoy was stopped before it reached the border, the driver found dead before he ever saw who fired. Each story was different, each one impossible to verify. But the details were always the same. A lone sniper, unseen and untouchable, striking from beyond the horizon. Some swore it was a copycat. Others insisted the ghost had returned. The chief never confirmed or denied it. He only smiled quietly whenever he heard the name. Because he knew the truth. Legends don't stay buried. They don't fade. They evolve. And somewhere, perhaps far from the desert, perhaps in a place where the air smelled of rain instead of sand, she was still watching through a scope, her breath slow, her heart steady, waiting for the one shot that mattered. Not for glory, not for records, but for something much older. For justice. For peace. For the promise she had always spoken of. Patience, discipline, and truth between shooter and target. And in that promise, the chief found comfort. Because long after the war ended, long after the reports were archived and the medals forgotten, there would still be stories told in firelight and silence. Stories of a woman who vanished into legend. Of a rifle that became more than steel. Of a ghost who watched the world from 3,000 meters away. And in those stories, she would never die.